When we look back at cold cases from the 80s, we often see them through a hazy, nostalgic lens. We think of teenagers hanging out at the local roller rink, watching local garage bands practice, and we think of a time that just felt simpler. But for 16-year-old Wendy Lynn Huggy, life was anything but simple. Wendy spent her childhood caught between two entirely different worlds: the glamorous, chaotic orbit of her mother in Illinois and the quiet retirement communities of Florida's Gulf Coast. Her mother, Susan Leverance, was a former Playboy bunny, and in the 1970s, Susan actually lived for a time at the legendary Chicago Playboy Mansion, traveling the country on Hugh Hefner's private jet as one of his elite jet bunnies. Susan later transitioned into working as a flight attendant for Air Wisconsin Airlines. It was a career that kept her in the air and away from home for long, grueling stretches. But because of that frantic schedule, Wendy grew up bouncing back and forth, frequently left in the care of her grandparents in Florida. Her aunt, Patty Spragg, would later recall that Wendy had an incredibly rough life trying to find her footing between those two extremes. By the time she hit her mid-teens, the instability caught up with her. Wendy dropped out of high school, and in a desperate bid for independence, she married a man named Eddie Freeman in Illinois. But the cycle of pain followed her. The marriage was allegedly abusive, and Wendy knew she had to get out. In early 1982, Wendy packed her bags, left her husband in Chicago for good, and moved to Holiday, Florida. She moved into a quiet, safe home with two people who represented absolute stability: her maternal grandparents, Sidney and Paula Richards. By April of 1982, Wendy had been living in Holiday for just about 2 months, and she was working incredibly hard to rebuild her life from scratch. She didn't have her high school diploma, but she put in the work and successfully earned her GED. Her Aunt Patty remembers that Wendy had a concrete plan. She was saving every dime she could because she wanted to attend beauty school and become a cosmetologist. To fund that dream, she had just landed a job at a local fast food restaurant. Her very first day of work at a local Wendy's was scheduled for April 8th, 1982. But there was another layer to Wendy's story, something her Aunt Patty said few people knew and almost no one talked about. Wendy was 3 to 4 months pregnant. We don't know if the father was the husband she had just fled in Chicago or someone else. But despite the immense weight of being a pregnant 16-year-old runaway wife, Wendy was looking forward. She had a loving support system with her grandparents, a new job lined up, and big aspirations. She was a darling little girl who finally felt safe. Which is why what happened on Wednesday, April 7th, completely shatters the idea that she left on her own accord. On the morning of April 7th, 1982, Sidney and Paula Richards loaded Wendy into their car and drove her from Pasco County down to Clearwater. They dropped her off a few blocks away from the Patrician Apartments, located at the intersection of Nursery Road and Belcher Road. Wendy's plan for the morning was to meet up with her uncle, Greg Richards. Greg was only 5 years older than Wendy, and he was a lot like a friend to her. He lived in those Patrician apartment complexes. It remains a gap in the timeline whether Wendy and her Uncle Greg actually ever connected that morning, but Wendy did meet up with a friend named Kim who lived in the same exact apartment complex. Wendy, Kim, and Kim's mother decided to make it a classic Florida spring day, and the three of them headed out to Clearwater Beach. After a day at the beach, Wendy needed a way back home to her grandparents' house in Holiday, and she didn't own a car, so she managed to get a ride over to the Countryside Mall. While at the mall, Wendy walked up to a payphone and called her grandfather, Sidney. She told him that he didn't need to drive down to Clearwater to pick her up. She told him that she was getting a ride from a friend, a man she only identified as Don, and said she would be home shortly. So this is where the timeline gets murky. According to some official reports, Wendy made that phone call around 11 p.m., but internet sleuths and locals have pointed out a massive flaw in that timing because the Countryside Mall closed its retail shops at 9 o'clock in 1982. The only thing that opens past 9 p.m. was the cinema, the ice skating rink, and the arcade. So did Wendy actually call at 6 p.m. to say she would be home by 11 p.m., or was she hanging out in the mall's nightlife late into the evening? Either way, Wendy Lynn Huggy never walked through Sidney and Paula's front door again. The next morning, April 8th, her first day of work at Wendy's came and went. Her uniform remained untouched, and Wendy vanished. This is a aged progressed picture. So when Wendy didn't come home, Sydney and Paula didn't wait. Within days, they went to the police to report their granddaughter missing, but this is where the system completely failed a 16-year-old child. Because Wendy had been married back in Illinois, Florida law viewed her as an emancipated legal adult. Finding nothing at the scene to immediately indicate a struggle or foul play, authorities simply surmised that Wendy had disappeared by choice. To them, she wasn't a missing, endangered teenager. She was an adult woman who was legally free to walk away from her life. And they closed her missing persons file just after 15 days. For 3 long years, Sydney and Paula lived in quiet agony. They knew in their hearts that their granddaughter, who was pregnant, excited for a new job, and finally safe, would never just abandon them without word. So finally, in 1985, when Wendy still hadn't made contact, her grandparents went back to the sheriff's office. This is when deputies finally realized that something had happened, and the case was reopened. But 3 years is an eternity. Crucial time had been lost, memories had faded, footprints had washed away, and the case file would eventually pass through the hands of 8 different detectives over the decades. One of those men was a patrol deputy when Wendy first vanished, a detective Bobby Ham, and when Ham later became a detective in the Crimes Against Children unit, Wendy's case became his absolute obsession. His colleagues said that she just got to him. He vowed that if it was the last thing he ever did, he would find her. In 2001, Detective Ham thought he finally had his answer. Investigators exhumed the remains of an unidentified woman floating off Anna Marie Island. The body had been tied to a concrete block with a rope wrapped around her waist. Crucially, the victim was wearing 2 turquoise rings, identical to the jewelry Wendy was known to wear. So Detective Ham poured everything into this lead, but a blood comparison with Wendy's mother Susan and dental records proved it wasn't her. It wasn't until a decade later in 2011 that those remains were finally identified as Amy Rose Hurst, a young mother who had vanished from Newport Richey in 1982. Her husband was ultimately charged and convicted with her murder. Wendy's Aunt Patty later said that, if nothing else, the search for Wendy brought closure to another grieving family. Unfortunately, Detective Bobby Ham passed away in 2007, never finding the girl he spent 27 years looking for. The case was passed to a Detective Lisa Shauneman, perhaps, who noted that Wendy deserved to have the world know how she lived and how she died. While the official records are kind of frozen in time, we have to look at the whispers left behind in the Clearwater community. And recently, some chilling connections have emerged from locals who still remember that era. So, do you remember the man named Don who Wendy said was giving her a ride home from the mall? Well, locals at the area recall that at the arcade inside the Countryside Mall, one of the few places open late at night, was allegedly owned and operated by a man named Donald, whom teenagers at the time described him as a real weirdo. So, could this arcade manager be the Don Wendy trusted for a ride back to Holiday? Perhaps. The rabbit hole goes even deeper. So an old acquaintance of Wendy's recently shared a memory online about a car ride they took shortly after Wendy went missing. They were in the car with a woman named Donna, who happened to be the assistant manager of the very same mall arcade. They drove over to the Patrician Apartments on Nursery Road, the exact complex where Wendy was last seen, to pick up Donna's sister. During that ride, the sister became visibly panicked and upset, terrified because of a prior incident where something happened to another girl who had been in that car. The arcade staff immediately shut up after that. Was the girl they were whispering about Wendy? Did the management of that mall know exactly what happened to the 16-year-old girl? So today, the silence surrounding Wendy's case is deafening. Her grandparents, Sydney and Paula, passed away without ever getting answers. Her mother, Susan, died, having carried the agonizing weight of her daughter's disappearance for the rest of her life. Wendy's half-brother, Cash, was born after Wendy vanished, and he never got to meet his older sister. Her Aunt Patty still catches herself looking for Wendy's face in grocery stores or on TV. Wendy didn't run away. She was a 16-year-old girl trying to heal, trying to build a career, and preparing to bring a new life into the world. If you lived in the Clearwater or Holiday areas in 1982, if you hung out at the Countryside Mall, or if you knew anything about a man named Don, please call the Florida Department of Law Enforcement or the Pasco County Sheriff's Office. No details are too small when a girl has been waiting 44 years to come home. I know this was a little bit longer of an episode, but thank you for watching Unsolved Florida, and we'll see you next time.